It does feel a little odd not having the choir here. I just have to admit that. So thank you. The congregation is always part of the choir. It's just that today you're a bigger part of the choir. Do you all know Brené Brown? Have you heard of her? Author, sociologist, researcher, storyteller. In her second TED Talk, following the enormous popularity of her first TED Talk, she sets out to expose the fallacy that vulnerability is weakness. So to do that, she asks the audience this question. How many of you, honestly, when you're thinking about doing something vulnerable or saying something vulnerable, think, oh God, vulnerability is weakness. This is weakness. How many of you think, she asked, think of vulnerability and weakness synonymously? And I imagine, same if we ask this today, most people in the audience raise their hands. And then she follows up by saying, now let me ask you this question. This past week at these TED Talks, how many of you, when you saw vulnerability up here on stage, thought that it was pure courage? And everyone in the audience raises their hands, claiming this sacred truth. Brown concludes, vulnerability is not weakness. She says, I define vulnerability as emotional risk, exposure, uncertainty. It fuels our daily lives, and I've come to the belief that vulnerability is our most accurate measurement of courage. We know that. We know it when we see it in others, but we still see it as a weakness to be avoided or denied for ourselves. We recognize the courage of other people when they risk being seen, being honest, facing uncertainty. But for me to make a regular habit, no thanks. Fine for them, too risky for me. We persist in this belief that we must never admit weakness. Other people, sure, but not me. We continue pretending to be invincible, claiming to be absolutely certain, projecting unwavering strength. We pledge allegiance to leaders and institutions who exude power, assert supremacy. We cling to the old lie that to show any vulnerability would be foolish, disastrous. And yet today, the teachings of both Jesus and Paul remind us of how accepting, admitting, even embracing our weakness opens us to nothing less than the power of God. In the reading today from his second letter to the Corinthians, Paul is addressing that community's obsession with spiritual gifts. They are impressed by, possessive of, competitive about who has the most enviable spiritual scorecard. And Paul could, he says, I could boast about my own spiritual resume. And the truth is, when you go back and read that, he really does. He really does. But he doesn't claim it. He just says, I know of a person. Reminds me of kind of a guy from Brooklyn saying, I know a guy. He's the guy. But he quickly goes on instead to boast not of his gifts or strengths, but of his weakness. He says that a thorn in his flesh was his weakness, and he asked God 3 times to remove it. He shares with the community how God declined that request with the explanation, my grace is sufficient for you. Power is made perfect in weakness. Lots of dissertations have been written speculating what that thorn may have been, but the important thing to note here is the effect that it had on Paul's understanding of the gospel. Rather than it being a hindrance to his faith, it was a catalyst for it. Rather than falling into that tempting trap of relying on his own sense of power and might, Paul becomes more fully aware that there's only one person to turn to. When all else fails, Paul finds the source of life and healing that never fails, and the only thing that ever truly and fully saves us, the grace and mercy of God. Grace is sufficient for us. This power becomes perfectly clear in our weakness. I have found that to be true in my own spiritual life. In my deepest, in those times where I felt the most authentic and true connection with God, it did not come in those moments when I felt delighted with my own accomplishments, or leaning on my own merits, or depending on my own abilities, or sure of my own self-sufficiency. I didn't need God then, I thought. It's been just the opposite. It has been when I was most desperate, most afraid, completely out of alternatives. It feels awful to be that vulnerable. Yet that's when we realize God's grace is indeed sufficient. It's in those moments that we fully know God's strength, because we are acutely aware of our own weakness. The light of Christ shines brightest when we are groping in the darkness. We desperately reach for God's saving grace when we realize we're drowning. We discover more deeply the life-changing truth that God's grace is sufficient. When we admit our weakness, then we can truly know God's power. And then we can sing with John Newton, I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. When we recognize our weakness, we can rely ever more fully on God's strength. When I am weak, then I am strong. Jesus knows that we have this tendency to avoid vulnerability. He knows it. He knows it's hard for us to rely on God instead of ourselves. And so he builds into discipleship some vulnerability and weakness. We see it today when he's sending out the apostles 2 by 2. They go out 2 by 2. Alone, because alone they may have been tempted to believe in their own greatness. They travel light, no bread, no bag, no money, no credit cards or Apple Pay. They live like the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, depending on God's providence and the kindness of strangers. This puts them in a mutual relationship with those they are ministering to. There's reciprocity rather than spiritual hierarchy. Everyone has something to give and everyone has something to receive. They share in that grounding truth that all of us are dependent on God's grace. We are all equal beneficiaries of God's providence. We are all powerless without the power of God's love. But there's something else to notice here. It's a subtle, but it's critical. Jesus isn't sending them out without power. That would be cruel. He gives them authority. He's not sending them without power so much as he's aligning them with real power. Jesus' instructions help them maintain focus on the grace they share rather than some personal power they may be tempted to think they wield. Feeling vulnerable is scary. We still resist it and deny it. We get angry and bitter because of it. I think that so much of the angst in our country, in our world, particularly at this moment, is because we feel powerless. Somehow we felt like we had the right or the expectation was reasonable that we would always be in charge and in control. But we can't change the news. We can't change the polls. We can't change people's minds. Maybe it's even more personable. I can't change my kids. I can't change my grandkids. I can't change that medical diagnosis. I can't repair or restore this relationship. And it feels awful to be so incredibly powerless and vulnerable, and yet, when we remember that vulnerability is not weakness, powerlessness becomes the crack that lets the true light in. And we discover, like Paul, that God's grace is sufficient, that we, when we are weak, we're strong. So let me give you a little prayer / earworm to hold on to this week as a way of kind of to avoid suppressing weakness and instead risking being honest and open with God. Make these words from that old hymn your prayer this week. I'm not going to sing it. I've almost sang it there for a second. I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk. Let me walk close to thee. When we admit our weakness, we then know God's strength. When we acknowledge our powerlessness, we are better able to hear those reassuring words, my grace is sufficient for you. When we are honest about the pain that we're holding, we know we experience God holding us, a power beyond ourselves. Then we can live courageous lives, held by that power that is made perfect in weakness. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be.